The fund would like to thank everyone who has helped the Madeleine campaign for their kindness, support and generosity. Madeleine's fund was set up to find Madeleine, support the family and bring the abductor or abductors to justice, and subject to that, help other missing children.
The night of May 3rd, 2007, in a quiet holiday resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal, became one of the most haunting mysteries of modern times. 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished from her family's apartment, leaving behind an empty bed and a silence that would echo across the world. In just a matter of days, what began as a desperate search for a missing child transformed into an international crusade. Newspapers carried her photograph on front pages. Television anchors spoke her name nightly, and people everywhere felt the ache of parents who had lost their little girl to the shadows. Amid this whirlwind of grief and sympathy, a fund was born. Its name carried a solemn promise, leaving no stone unturned. It was meant to be a beacon of hope, a vehicle to channel the world's generosity into action, to find Madeleine, to bring justice, and to support a devastated family. Donations poured in, pennies from pensioners, checks from celebrities, gifts from strangers who would never meet the child, but felt bound to her story. The world believed they were helping. They believed every coin dropped into that fund was a step toward bringing Madeleine home. But time, as it always does, changed the picture. Days turned into months, months into years. Nearly 2 decades later, Madeleine is still missing, her fate unknown. Yet the fund remains, holding not only money, but also layers of controversy, suspicion, and unanswered questions. Was it truly the vessel of hope the world was told it was? Or did it become something else? A shield for reputation? A mechanism of control, a symbol of privilege dressed as charity? These are the questions that linger, whispered across headlines, dissected in forums, debated in living rooms. For many, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann is no longer just a mystery about a missing child. It is also the story of what happens when grief, power, money, and media collide. And it leaves us with a chilling paradox. While one little girl was lost to the night, the truth itself may have been lost in the noise. Only 12 days after Madeleine disappeared, Kate and Jerry McCann stood before cameras and announced the creation of a fund. The speed of its launch was striking, an effort that was emotional, polished, and remarkably well-branded for a family in crisis. But there was one detail that many missed at the time. The fund was not set up as a registered charity. Instead, it was established as a private limited company in London. On paper, this might have seemed like a minor technicality. In reality, it changed everything. In the United Kingdom, charities that exist for the benefit of a single individual cannot gain charitable status. By registering as a company, the McCanns avoided the strict oversight of the Charity Commission, the national body tasked with ensuring transparency and accountability. This meant no mandatory audits, no public obligation to disclose detailed spending, and no independent watchdogs asking hard questions. The fund, therefore, was free to operate in a gray zone, legally valid, but opaque to those who gave so generously. The board of directors reflected this insularity. At its center sat Kate and Jerry themselves. Beside them were trusted allies, Brian Kennedy, a wealthy businessman who became one of their most vocal supporters, Michael Lynette, an accountant, Edward Smethurst, a lawyer, and John Corner, a family friend and media producer. On paper, these names brought financial and legal expertise. In practice, they ensured that control never left the family's inner circle. Every decision about where the money went, how much, to whom, and for what purpose, remained in the hands of people bound emotionally, personally, and reputationally to the outcome. Independent voices were nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, the donations kept flowing in. In its first year alone, the fund raised nearly $185 million. Contributions came from ordinary families sending small sums, from communities organizing events, and from high-profile figures lending both money and prestige. The News of the World donated $25,000. Retail magnate Sir Philip Green contributed the same. Simon Cowell added $5,000. Richard Branson offered $100,000 specifically for legal fees. Even J.K. Rowling and theater mogul Bill Kenwright quietly gave, though their exact amounts were never disclosed. These were not just financial gestures. They were endorsements that elevated the McCann case above countless others. Alongside donations, the fund also drew revenue from merchandise, bracelets, t-shirts, and bumper stickers bearing Madeline's face. Each item symbolized both solidarity and sadness, but collectively they built a financial war chest that few families of missing children could ever dream of. Within a year, the fund had become not only a lifeline, but also a fortress, insulated by money, influence, and media sympathy. To the public, it looked like a noble mission, a structured campaign to leave no stone unturned. But beneath the surface, the very structure of the fund raised troubling questions. Why was it built like a business rather than a charity? Why was control kept so tightly within the family circle? And most importantly, would the money truly serve the purpose it was given for, or would it become something else entirely? It did not take long for the first cracks to appear in the carefully polished image of the fund. When the company's first financial reports were finally released, the revelations shocked many who had given in good faith. Among the earliest expenditures were payments toward the McCann's mortgage, about $2,000 a month. For parents who had left their medical jobs to devote themselves to the search, supporters might have understood the financial strain. But donors had not believed their money would be used to cover private household bills. They thought they were funding searches, investigations, and the hunt for their missing daughter. The backlash was immediate. For many, it felt like betrayal. Under mounting pressure, and after being declared arguidos, official suspects, by Portuguese police in September 2007, the McCanns agreed to stop using the fund for personal financial support. But the damage was done. The mortgage scandal cast a long shadow over everything that came after. Another controversial chapter unfolded when the McCanns hired a Spanish detective agency, Método 3. They poured more than $250,000 into the firm's efforts over 10 months. The agency made bold promises. Madeleine would be found by Christmas, they claimed. They spoke of underworld contacts and insider leads. Yet their results were nothing but disappointment. Dubious sightings, empty tips, and false assurances consumed time and money, but yielded nothing concrete. In the end, the contract was quietly terminated. Donors were outraged. £250,000 gone, and not a single new lead to show for it. Critics asked, why had the fund trusted an unproven firm with such a massive sum? Why was there no due diligence, no consultation with recognized experts? Public relations soon became another lightning rod. In the first year alone, the fund spent over $80,000 on media campaigns, posters, newspaper ads, and TV appeals across Europe. Another $130,000 went to campaign management, including the salary of a temporary spokesperson. Eventually, Clarence Mitchell, a former British government PR official, stepped in to lead the communication full-time. Though his salary was said to have been covered by Brian Kennedy rather than the fund itself, the PR machine became deeply entwined with the fund's image. Carefully staged press conferences, emotional appeals, and legal threats against tabloids followed. What began as a campaign to find a missing child increasingly looked like an operation to manage the McCann's reputation. The controversies did not end there. In 2009, the fund financed a lawsuit against Portuguese detective Gonçalo Amaral, who had published a book claiming Madeleine had died in the apartment and that her parents had staged an abduction. The McCanns sued for libel, but not only did the case fail, it further enraged the public that donated money had been used to silence critics rather than search for Madeleine. For supporters, this crossed a moral line. They had not contributed to wage legal battles. They had contributed to bring a child home. Individually, some of these expenditures might have been defensible: mortgage support during crisis, PR to keep the case alive, private detectives to chase leads. But together, they formed a pattern that was hard to ignore. Money meant for a desperate search was being used in ways that seemed increasingly disconnected from that mission. And with no independent oversight, every decision was made inside a closed circle, shielded from external accountability. For many, the question grew louder. How much of the fund truly went toward finding Madeleine, and how much went toward protecting everyone else? As more details emerged, the cracks in the fund's image widened into chasms. Donors who had once felt united in hope began to feel deceived. The fund, once seen as a symbol of determination, started to look more like a fortress, protecting not only the family, but also the narrative surrounding them. What had been given in trust now seemed repurposed for reputation, and that shift left scars. The disillusionment cut deepest among those who had given what little they had. Pensioners who had mailed 5-pound notes, parents who had donated part of their savings, children who had sold bracelets in schoolyards, all believed they were helping to bring Madeleine home. When they learned that their sacrifices had helped pay mortgages, fund failed detectives, or bankroll lawsuits, the betrayal felt personal. It wasn't just about money. It was about hope misdirected, faith eroded. Other families with missing children looked on in quiet outrage. Carrie Needham, mother of Ben Needham, who vanished in Greece in 1991, watched the McCann case gather millions in donations, international media attention, and government backing. She pleaded for years to keep her son's name alive, but never received the same scale of support. Likewise, the family of 8-year-old Joanna Cipriano, who disappeared in Portugal just a few years before Madeleine, never saw billboards, press conferences, or high-profile campaigns. Joanna's mother was swiftly accused and convicted, despite inconsistencies in the case, and she faced the legal system alone, without the benefit of a PR machine or international sympathy. The contrast was stark and painful. 2 missing children, 2 grieving families, yet only one received the resources of a global movement. For many observers, it became a symbol of inequality, of how class, nationality, and influence determine whose tragedy the world embraces and whose it quietly ignores. In online forums, in newspaper comment sections, and even in interviews with other bereaved parents, the same questions surfaced again and again. Why did the McCanns receive such unprecedented support? Was it their profession, their nationality, their connections? And if justice can be swayed by such factors, what hope remains for the families who lack them? The fund had begun as a vessel for hope, but by now it carried a different weight. Its silence became the loudest betrayal. No apology for choices that alienated supporters. No acknowledgement of the imbalance it revealed. What once united people across nations now divided them. Instead of being remembered as a mission for truth, the fund was increasingly remembered as a lesson in how easily trust can be broken and how deeply it hurts when it is. From the beginning, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann was never just a family tragedy. It was also a political and media storm. Within hours of her vanishing, the British Embassy in Lisbon was in direct contact with Portuguese authorities. Diplomats were assigned to support the family, an extraordinary level of involvement rarely seen in cases of British citizens missing abroad. The speed and scale of this response hinted at something unusual. The McCanns were not going to be treated like ordinary parents. The influence only grew. In 2011, 4 years after Madeleine's disappearance, the British government launched Operation Grange, a metropolitan police review and reinvestigation of the case. Over the years, it consumed more than $13 million in public funds, an amount unmatched by any other missing child investigation in the UK. To put that into perspective, the operation cost more than several combined terrorism and homicide investigations. Yet, despite the staggering expense, no definitive breakthrough has ever emerged. For many, this raised uncomfortable questions. Why did this one case command such extraordinary resources? Was it purely about finding a missing child? Or was it also about preserving Britain's image, about projecting the sense that the government was doing everything possible to protect its citizens? Critics argued that Operation Grange had become as much a PR gesture as a police operation, a symbol meant to reassure the public rather than deliver results. At the same time, the family's public relations machinery worked relentlessly. With Clarence Mitchell, a former government press officer at the helm, the McCann's narrative was carefully managed. Emotional appeals, polished statements, and tightly controlled press briefings framed them not only as grieving parents, but also as victims of institutional failure and media cruelty. Dissenting voices, particularly those of Portuguese investigators, were dismissed or discredited. The line between justice and image blurred until it was almost impossible to separate the two. The disparity was clear. While families like the Needhams struggled to afford even basic posters, the McCanns traveled internationally, Madrid, Amsterdam, Berlin, Washington, D.C., to keep Madeleine's story alive. These trips were strategic, designed to maintain global sympathy and media attention. But they also underscored a chilling truth. Influence, not just innocence, determines which tragedies the world remembers. For the McCanns, this machinery of politics and media offered insulation. For others, it symbolized exclusion. When justice begins to look like a red carpet, available only to those with connections, visibility, and resources, the public cannot help but ask, is the game rigged before it even begins? The result was a paradox. The McCanns were portrayed as ideal victims, educated, articulate, respectable. Yet the very privilege that elevated them also bred suspicion. Were they protected because of who they were, or because of what really happened? And in the shadows of those unanswered questions, trust in the system eroded further. In September 2007, more than 4 months after Madeline's disappearance, Portuguese police formally declared Kate and Jerry McCann arguidos, official suspects. For a world that had been watching with sympathy, the announcement was shocking. How could grieving parents suddenly become suspects in their own daughter's case? At the heart of the suspicion was a forensic controversy. Investigators claimed that DNA evidence found in the trunk of a rental car the McCanns had hired weeks after Madeleine vanished showed 15 out of 19 markers consistent with her genetic profile. Initially, this appeared to be a breakthrough, a potential link suggesting that Madeleine's body had been moved. But when the UK's Forensic Science Service analyzed the samples, they concluded that the evidence was too complex and too degraded to be conclusive. It could neither definitively match Madeleine nor rule her out. For the Portuguese authorities, however, the uncertainty reinforced their suspicions. Coupled with the fact that Kate McCann declined to answer 48 police questions during an 11-hour interrogation, on the advice of her lawyers, the suspicion deepened. To many, her silence suggested evasion. In contrast, Jerry McCann answered every question, but the contrast between the two fueled a media storm that painted Kate as secretive, cold, or worse. Tabloids seized on every detail, from the way Kate held herself during press conferences to the absence of visible tears during televised appeals. Entire narratives were built on stereotypes about how a grieving mother should behave. In the public imagination, suspicion became theater, and the line between fact and speculation blurred beyond recognition. Yet the case against the McCanns never solidified. In July 2008, Portuguese prosecutors lifted their arguido status, citing a lack of evidence. No charges were filed, no trial took place. Officially, they were free from suspicion. Unofficially, doubts lingered. To this day, the couple has never been formally exonerated. They were cleared by the absence of proof, not by the presence of truth. Years later, in October 2023, the Portuguese police issued a rare public apology to the McCann family. They admitted to mishandling critical aspects of the original investigation, failing to secure the crime scene, neglecting key protocols, and allowing errors that compromised the search for Madeleine. While some praised the apology as a step toward reconciliation, others saw it as too little, too late. The apology did nothing to erase the years of suspicion or the damage inflicted on the McCanns' reputation. And so, the case remains suspended in a gray zone, a family not proven guilty, yet never fully free of doubt. In that unresolved space lies one of the greatest injustices of all, the heavy burden of suspicion that endures long after the evidence has gone cold. Nearly 2 decades have passed since the night Madeleine McCann vanished, and yet her case remains one of the most enduring mysteries of modern true crime. The fund created in her name still exists, holding hundreds of thousands of pounds, but it has not brought the resolution so many once believed it would. What began as a symbol of hope has become a symbol of division, raising hard questions not only about this one case, but about justice itself. The lessons are uncomfortable. First, transparency matters. Donors gave not simply money, but faith, believing their contributions were helping a desperate search for a child. When that trust was redirected toward mortgages, failed detectives, legal battles, and reputation management, the damage was more than financial. It fractured the bond between public compassion and private accountability. Once broken, that bond is almost impossible to repair. Second, privilege shapes outcomes. The McCanns, as middle-class doctors with media connections and political support, received levels of aid and attention that other families of missing children could only dream of. The stories of Ben Needham and Joanna Cipriano highlight the disparity. Both were children lost, but their families lacked the resources, the networks, or the image that inspired global sympathy. Justice, in theory, is blind. In practice, it often sees status, nationality, and power all too clearly. Third, perception can overwhelm truth. The media, with its relentless cycles of suspicion, absolution, and spin, played as central a role in this case as any forensic lab or police officer. Headlines and press conferences reshaped public opinion in ways that no courtroom ever could. The McCanns were never convicted, but they were never truly cleared either. Instead, they were suspended in a narrative written not by law, but by perception. And finally, the most painful lesson of all, Madeleine remains missing. For all the money, all the influence, all the headlines and investigations, the one truth that matters most has never been answered. Where did she go? What happened that night in Portugal? The case of Madeleine McCann is not just a story about a lost child. It is a story about the fragility of trust, the reach of privilege, and the silence that comes when justice falters. It forces us to confront a haunting question. If truth can be so easily obscured by power and perception, how can ordinary families ever hope to find it? Perhaps the only certainty left is this: justice that depends on privilege is not justice at all. And until Madeleine's fate is known, the silence around her case will remain one of the darkest echoes of our time.